Welcome to Mex Moves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance. This is Damien.
This is Eduardo.
How are you, Eduardo? I hear you're in London, right?
Yep. I'm a little bit far away, but very packed to Mexico.
Good. Well, this week we have a great interview with Ricardo Cacho. Ricardo is a counsel at top Mexican law firm Wobeser y Sierra. He's an expert on financial crime, anti-corruption, compliance, former top official in Mexico's finance ministry, also focused on financial crime, among other issues. And he's going to talk about the government intervention of the three financial institutions, CI, Intercam, and Vector, following the sanctions from U.S. Treasury and FinCEN. We're also going to talk a little bit about news at Mexico's credit card FIntechs, Klar, Plata, and Nu. And then I think we're going to address BYD postponing its decision to invest in Mexico, but Giant Motors, another Chinese-related car business in Mexico, going ahead with a big investment in Hidalgo. So that's what we have, Eduardo.
Yeah, that sounds good, Damien. So why don't you start with the first topic you want to address?
Sure. Well, just wanted to, before we go into the interview with Ricardo, it's now been a week since the U.S. announced the sanctions on CI, Intercam, and Vector. Almost immediately after that announcement, the day after, as we saw, the government intervened in the banks and took the two banks and the brokerage, Vector, and took effective control of them. I think we can say, now that a week has gone by, the financial market fallout has been very, very limited. The peso's stable, even stronger. Stock market is up. Money market is functioning well. So there's a sort of favorite sport in Mexico and probably everywhere in the world to sort of criticize the authorities for poorly managing situations. But if the score is how financial variables have performed, I think we can give some credit to the finance ministry and the CNBV for managing this. For managing the fallout relatively well. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't massive kind of administrative headaches. You know, CI is the biggest fiduciary in Mexico, and there's a bunch of FIBRAs or REITs that have their trust managed by CI. They're going to have to move elsewhere. In the meantime, it's going to be complicated. CI is also a common representative, a lot of bonds in Mexico. They're going to have to change that. So don't want to underestimate the administrative headaches that this is causing, although a note this morning from JP Morgan said that FIBRAs, the REITs, will be able to pay their coupons because the money's not with CI Bank, but with other banks that U.S. funds can deal with, so that they think the coupons will be paid. And even if a coupon isn't paid, which is not the current expectation, it's just a question of timing. But the broader macroeconomic financial fallout seems to have been perhaps less than one might have expected a week ago. What's your take, Eduardo?
Yeah, I think you're right, Damien, that the way the authorities stepped in quickly and decisively helped. The markets have not had any major repercussions, although it is a serious accusations for these three companies. I also was surprised by how quickly Intercam moved to try to salvage its U.S. operations by selling them to a company called StoneX Group, a financial institution based in the United States. The one that Intercam has in the United States and Puerto Rico were not tainted by the allegations. So there is money maybe to be made out of that. Obviously, the Intercam name is a little bit soiled at the moment, but the rapidity which the company has moved to sell them indicates that they will probably try to rescue as much as they can of those two operations. I also wonder whether CI Banco was going to be able to separate its fiduciary business because of what we're already seeing, that it's been sided or moved to the side by many of the companies that had their trust with them. I was wondering whether they could have done that as well to try to avoid being tainted by the accusations. It hasn't happened, so we'll have to wait and see. But yes, overall, the financial systems work hard. These three companies are in trouble, unfortunately, and they, I guess, all of the three of them are trying to save as much as they can, as their names were mentioned, and created a lot of problem, mainly because they were cut out of the U.S. financial system, which is the most important financial system in the world. And without that, especially CI and Intercam have lost a big chunk of their business.
Yeah, I don't think CI can really move the trust business because it's inside the bank, and it's the bank that's been intervened in, the bank that obviously has been sanctioned. So, whereas in the case of Intercam, these were businesses outside the bank, and I think in any case the clients want to move elsewhere. So I think the best they can probably do is move people to other places, and then other places sign new deals. But I think it's going to be difficult to imagine them functioning under CI at this point. But it's going to be it seems as if this moment is going to be a sort of, as much as possible, an orderly transition to another institution. I think the other kind of fallout from this is probably going to be that the CNBV is going to be hugely focused, as we're going to hear from Ricardo. It's a bit of a slap in the face to the Mexican regulators. It was the US regulators that took this action. They're going to be very focused on this issue and these three institutions and any other institutions. There was talk about, which I think is somewhat misunderstood, about 10 institutions having operations with some of these Chinese companies that have been named in Mexican newspapers, but those other 7 are subject to these sanctions. But clearly that's generated a little bit of unease that others might be coming, although the ABM, the Bankers Association, has sort of said that as far as they know, there isn't anyone else coming. And Banorte gave a conference call a couple of days ago to investors, and CFO said that as far as he knows, there isn't anyone else coming. So I think that things have stabilized, but people are worried that the CNBV is going to be so focused on this that other things that they need to do, such as giving the new licenses to fintechs that want banks, or giving the fintechs that have the first stage of a license but now need kind of operating approval. There's obviously New, and there's Revolut, and there's other banks, Plata, that are looking for full operating approval, having got the initial license. I think all of these things might get delayed because the CNBV, after all, was already pretty understaffed, and even before all of this. So there will be a lot of secondary impacts of this, and obviously a horrific impact on the three institutions and on the shareholders and on the people who work there. And it's very sad what has happened, and it's very sad that it happened without proof being given.
Correct. Yeah, I agree. Seems like it's going to be in an orderly fashion, but the pain that was inflicted will not be minor, and will have many ripples along the way in the next few months.
And I recommend Eduardo's Substack on this, actually, Material Gris. He wrote a great Substack, Eduardo. Congrats last week on the fallout from this and the message it sends to the Mexican financial system from the Americans.
Thank you, Damien. That's very nice. Yeah.
So moving on, also in the financial sector, there was some news, Eduardo, as you probably saw, about Plata and Klar, to fintech credit card businesses. I just mentioned Plata. But Plata announced that it issued an unsecured $120 million bond at a pretty high coupon, 15.5% in dollars. But I guess they have to start somewhere with unsecured financing, and this is how they've done it. I guess their bet is that rate will come down as they prove their creditworthiness. And they also did a $100 million private placement through BTG Pactual to a hedge fund, I guess. As I understand it, that was secured. Plata has its bank license. It was recently valued at equity at $1.5 billion after a $160 million equity raise. If they have, as they've said, about 1 million cardholders, that's you're valuing each cardholder, at $150,000. If they've now grown to 1.5 million cardholders, the existing cardholder is worth 100, which is obviously a huge amount of money. But New did have valuations like that a few years ago when it was growing fast as Plata is. So the analysis of the VC funds that are putting money into it, both equity and fixed income now, is that they have many more customers, and so the profit per customer can go down as they raise their base. But they've said they're putting $1 billion into this business, so it's real money. But Plata is made up of many of the former Tinkoff the Russian fintech that basically was taken over by Putin and his oligarch friends after the invasion of Ukraine, and Tinkoff and other people related to Tinkoff moved to Mexico and or invested in Mexico to found this business, and it's going full steam ahead. And then you got Klar. Last week, it announced a $190 million raise. I think 170 was equity and 20 was debt, and a post-money valuation of $800 million. And Klar is growing very fast, helped obviously by these recent equity raises. But it's still losing money, it should be said. They, unlike Plata, which isn't yet releasing numbers that I can see, Klar is a regulated SOFIPO, and back in April, the last numbers that I see, it had net income losses. Last year, it lost a fair amount of money, so it's still got some way to go before it reaches profitability and ready for an IPO, which I guess is what General Atlantic, which led the latest raise and the previous ones as well, is looking for. And Nu, which also got its sort of first stage of its bank license, reported in pretty hefty losses actually in April, 700 million, triple the previous month, triple April last year. So no sign yet of an improvement in their unit economics. And unlike Klar or even Story, they're still reporting hefty negative risk-adjusted margins. Basically, their losses from write-offs and from non-performing loans kind of are exceeding the profit they're making from their difference between their cost of funding and what the credit card holders pay. They affected a bit or a lot by the deposits have been so successful. They're now 5 times loans, and they have been paying more to deposit holders than you can get from that money. So they've been paying over the CETES rate. Now, at the very end of April, Nu slashed its rates on deposits, probably reflecting the excess liquidity and the losses. And so you should expect Nu's numbers to begin to improve when they report them back in May. So I would say still a lot of investor interest in these credit card fintechs that are expanding into other products. Clearly, they've been offering deposits, at least in the case of Klar and Nu and Story, for a while. Plata plans to do that shortly and then become sort of full-scale banks in the case of Plata and Nu and no doubt Story before time. But they're still challenged on profitability and still challenged, I would argue, on unit economics. If you look at adjusted sort of risk net interest margin as the best way of looking at unit economics for the companies that report their numbers.
Yeah, two things caught my attention, Damien, on these 3 transactions that you're talking about. One is that in Plata, this oversubscription of their bonds was 1.7, the number of total sold, which is a good number. I think almost twice the amount that they raised, which indicates appetite. And then on Clark, I saw that Grupo Televisa and Grupo Formula, 2 media companies, participated in the roundup. So I guess that's also what we had talked about before about media exchanging time in their media companies for capital, I guess, for an equity in the company. Those were the 2 things.
That's right. So both Televisa and Formula will be media for equity, non-cash, but probably a small amount of the total 170, because you can't buy that much media, even if you wanted to. So I would guess that it's definitely less.
I guess that they just put the name down. People know them.
Yeah.
But anyway,
So, and Televisa now has about 25 of these media for equity investments. I think that the challenge they have is there have been very few exits yet.
Exactly.
A lot of so all of these companies are still in the investment phase, and very few of them have actually been able to sold either through an IPO or through a.
Yeah, it's going to take some time for Televisa to make some money out of that, if ever.
Yeah, they also have Voila in their portfolio. So they have a couple of fintechs at the moment.
I think I saw in Axis the total amount is about $300 million of these ad for equity transactions, but I don't know.
And then moving on, Eduardo, did you see the BYD announce that it is going to postpone, for now at least, the investment in a Mexico factory, which had previously said it was planning to do, and it cited Trump and tariff and U.S. trade risks as a reason. This was a story in Bloomberg, and they at the same time they announced that they're They opened this plant in Brazil, in Bahia, which is going to be very big. I think 150,000 car capacity, with plans to double it. So Mexico, which was going to be a base presumably for exports to the US, is going to lose out on that investment. And in the past, BYD had also expressed some concerns that because of Mexico's integration with the US, they were sort of concerned about technological know-how being kind of passed on to the US.
Right. And even President Sheinbaum had kind of given them a cold shoulder when she was asking her news briefings about it. And she said, well, there's never been a full announcement, or it hasn't been decided. So I guess this is the end result of something that it's very much related to the China-US fights, trade fights, and Mexico caught in between because its interests are much more aligned with the US. So I guess it's not a big surprise, but it shows you how the trade wars are affecting investment in this country, in this case, negatively. One would hope that the nearshoring would come by, but it doesn't seem to be accelerating yet. So we'll have to wait and see.
There was an announcement about this company called Giant Motors in Latin America, GML. It's about $150 million, so relatively small by car standards investment. And they assemble cars for the Chinese brand JAC, and their output is going to grow from 30 to 60,000 vehicles, apparently scalable to 100,000. And GML, which is mainly assembling cars that are sort of, for the most part, the value added is imported from China, is backed by Inbursa, the Carlos Slim financial bank and financial entity, and the Mastery family. And these cars are both traditional kind of petroleum cars and also electric vehicles. So smaller investment, but the good news on that side.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, but yeah, that's good.
Yeah, they'd basically gone from 0 to almost 10% last year. It was a good story in white paper in the daily newsletter that they sent, that their market share in the first quarter actually slipped a bit from 9.5% to 8.2%. And MG, which is the top Chinese player in Mexico's sales, were down a little. Mexico market is very much dominated by the Japanese. Nissan has a whopping, or at least in the first quarter, had a whopping 40% market share. It struggled in the rest of the world, Nissan, but it's in Mexico, it's still the number one player. And Toyota and Honda doing well. And some of the European brands took a bit of a hit in the quarter. I saw that Mexico sold according to white paper, 2 Bentleys in the first quarter. I wonder who those lucky owners are and where they are.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen a Bentley in Mexico, actually.
But yeah, it would be interesting to find out.
And just to wrap up, Eduardo, it was also a good story in Bloomberg on, I don't know if you got a chance to saw it in your old house, on cargo theft on Mexico's highways. There's every 50 minutes, they reported, there's a cargo sort of hijacking in Mexico. There are sort of fake checkpoints, spike strips, armed hijackings. In 2024, there were 24,000 thefts reported, and the losses are reported at $370 million. And obviously those costs from these highway hijackings or theft get passed on to the end consumer. And also apparently it's driving a shortage in drivers who don't, especially places like Puebla, Estado de Mexico, Querétaro, the state of Querétaro. They, for understandable reasons, they don't want to be driving in those states. So it's quite difficult, apparently, according to the Bloomberg story, to find drivers in those places.
Yeah, not surprising. It's become a dangerous profession in a certain way. So it was always, but now add that the perils of driving in Mexican roads, the perils of being stopped and probably threatened, and then your merchandise being stolen. It's not a pleasant experience, I'm sure.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have with us today Ricardo Cacho. Ricardo is a counsel at Wobeser y Sierra, a top law firm in Mexico. His focus is financial crime, anti-corruption, compliance. He's worked in Mexico's finance ministry. Previous to von Wobeser, he's general director of procedural control. He's had a key role in Mexico's criminal system transition to an accusatory system, and he's litigated before Mexico's Supreme Court. He's represented Mexico at numerous international organizations. Ricardo, how are you today?
Hi, Damian. I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Hi, Ivan.
It's a pleasure. So, Ricardo, I mean, obviously the subject of the day is the announcement last week by FinCEN, the U.S. Treasury, that these three entities, CI, Intercam, and Casa Bolsa, in 21 days from then, wouldn't be able to operate with financial institutions in the United States, regulated in the United States. What's your take on that? Is any bank safe in Mexico, given what happened last week, and that these banks have obviously been massively impacted by that announcement?
Well, it's a great question. I think every bank should be doing their homework. If that answers in a way what you mean, I don't think a bank will be safe if they're not doing their part in preventing money laundering and the financing of terrorism. I think it's very, very obvious to us that the U.S. has a mission. It is going to go after this mission for the next years. I think with all the resources that they have in several of the departments that are involved in these kinds of matters, the Treasury, the DOJ, Homeland Security, etc. And banks in Mexico have a reputation. This is, from my experience, being a liaison with the DOJ, the IRS, with many other agencies, FBI, DEA, along the years. I think that the U.S.'s perspective in certain areas of the government is that Mexican financial institutions are not doing all of the work they have to do to prevent these kinds of crimes. And being in the private sector, I also see that there is much to do in order to really be in a compliance level. And I think some institutions try, some have a framework, but the part I believe that is the most important thing for the U.S. authorities is that the programs, that the systems they have in place are really efficient, that they are in fact doing what they have to do, recognizing suspicious transactions, blocking the ones they have to block, and really doing a due diligence. So I would stop there in case there's more you want to follow up on that question.
Well, I guess specifically, what do they need? I mean, you said they have to do their homework and they have to invest in systems. But if you were sitting down with a Mexican bank, big, small, or intermediate, what specific steps or concrete steps do you think many have to take that in your experience that they're not taking right now?
Well, first of all, I think that they have to elevate the standards. I think that they have to have legal assistance, not only from Mexican lawyers, but also from American lawyers. And so that the level of compliance that they are really taking into account is not only reliable for Mexican authorities and Mexican legal frameworks, but also for the American one. I think this is a moment where certain messages from the American government are in line with, okay, I know that Mexican banks have a regulatory system, they have supervisors, they have authorities, but we're the ones that are going to make the decisions in whether there's compliance or not the Mexican authorities. They can make their own decisions, but we're not going to rely on them entirely. So that is where I believe that there has to be a tying of compliance with the regulatory system that is expected also in the US. And the other thing is that these institutions have to start thinking about not only money laundering, which used to be the main area of worrisome, but also financing of terrorism. I think financing of terrorism for many years, it has been something that in Mexico is said to be outside the scope, not relevant. We don't have terrorism here, and we don't have financing of Middle Eastern countries through Mexican entities. Now, I think the framework and the message from the American government is you have to consider the financing of terrorism. And so this is different even though there are rules in place that can be applicable for both matters, it is not exactly the same. So you don't have to stop when you're thinking about money laundering and you're assessing money laundering risks. Now you have to assess the financing of illegal organizations, particularly in Mexico, organized crime, that now for the US is considered a terrorist organization, at least 6 of them that we all know.
Ricardo, one thing that caught my attention from the US government's announcement was the use of the new laws that were passed last year called the Fentanyl Sanctions Act and the Fentanyl Act as the basis for their claims that these three Mexican institutions had been failing. And what is at least surprising to me is that they don't have to prove necessarily, that they just need to be suspicious of these operations. I think that raises the risks for the system in Mexico, because how do you fend off against such a claim when you don't even have received any proof of your wrongdoing? Am I exaggerating in highlighting that this is something new that the US can use against you in a very arbitrary way, if I may say so?
Well, let me see. It's a great question, Eduardo. I think that it is new. It is something that many of the American lawyers we've been talking with for the past months, and especially for the past days after this new actions taken by the Treasury. Without me being an American lawyer, I do see that it is new. It is something unprecedented, so we don't know exactly what the exact reach of these acts may be or will be. 3, they can be challenged in court. As I understand, they can be challenged, but it's not easy to win these kinds of challenges as to other analogous precedents. 4, I think there are many different acts with different consequences that can be relevant for financial institutions in Mexico. One of them is this new act that you're mentioning, Eduardo, and it has a certain standard of proof which is not as high as other different legal norms that the US has. For example, if you need, of course, for a prosecution of a criminal trial against somebody for financing of terrorism, of any FTO, then you will have a big burden of proof that you have to comply with as an authority, which is beyond a reasonable doubt of the responsibility of someone being involved in a crime like these. Then you have the civil aspects or consequences that one can face if they are sued through that different legal injunction, let's say. And that will have another burden, which is different from the one of the Fentanyl Act, which is different from the criminal prosecution. And you also have the OFAC lists, which are more similar, as I see, to these kinds of acts that we're seeing right now, to the Fentanyl Act, in relation to the fact that you do not have to have beyond a reasonable doubt, you do not have to bring it to a jury, as in the civil or the criminal case would have to go through. And so these kinds of acts are very, let's say, aggressive. I would use that word in the line of your questioning. And so it doesn't mean that it can be arbitrary, the actions that the US can take. I wouldn't put my bets on them being arbitrary actions, because I know the US government, I know many public servants from the US government, and I think that the great majority of them will act in good faith and will act in the pursuance of justice and the pursuit of justice. I do think so. And so they will be careful, because if they do not act according to rules, laws, or at least some kind of evidence, they, as public servants, or the authorities as entities, can get into trouble. And so I think that it is not easy to say that they will do it just in an arbitrary fashion. But of course, there's always politics, there's always diplomacy, and we know that it's a bit unpredictable under this administration. But I don't think they'll just do it with, just having a communication without any single confirmation of having evidence or having some good information that things like these are happening, given the seriousness of the allegations. So I wouldn't think that it will be arbitrary, but the level of burden of proof for these kinds of acts are lower than in cases of trials and things like that. If that answers your question.
No, it does want to sound like I'm defending actions that are potentially criminal by any standard. Now, I'm here to try to find out what actually happened. And one thing that highlighted also one thing that I noticed after reviewing the cases is the small amounts of money involved regarding the huge size of trade that goes between our two countries, Mexico and the U.S. I know that $1 that comes from drug money should be dealt harshly. Yet, to me, it's a bit surprising to see how little money at least was mentioned in the three cases versus what we trade. And I was wondering if the Treasury could have used other means to try to send a message rather than blocking these three companies from doing business with U.S. operations, sending them basically to a very dark place that they might not even come out of it alive. What's your take on how they proceeded in those terms?
I agree. It's a dark place they're in right now. They might not come out of it alive. I agree with the statement that you're using in regards to the low amounts of the fentanyl potential operations, right? Because if you see the decisions that were taken in each one of the banks, there is first like a statement regarding money laundering in general with organized crime, and then specificities about fentanyl. So what I think is that if you add both aspects to them, it becomes relevant when you're talking about more than $40 million. I remember in one of the cases, more than $10 million in another case. And then you join that with the specific fentanyl operations, which are lower, as you're saying. They have to be very careful, and institutions in Mexico have also to establish a reasonable system, program, or to make decisions that do not paralyze them as institutions, in the sense that if it is a little bit where you were going, Eduardo, saying, well, I mean, come on, if one employee is going to let pass $10,000 that goes to a Chinese company that in the end goes to a fentanyl operation, and I don't see that, I mean, it's hard to deal with the impossible, right? And that will make the whole bank or the entire financial institution collapse. It does seem like something delicate and potentially harsh given the circumstances when you're talking about a whole structure, right? It's not a physical, natural person saying yes or no to every single decision. It's an institution, some with thousands of people behind them, and you have to have certain controls. And no single institution is going to be perfect or unwaverably, right? So the risk in one side is saying, hey, if I cannot stop one operation that goes to fentanyl, then I'm done. I'm going to paralyze my institution. I'm going to do nothing because it's an impossible objective. Then the other part is saying, yeah, I'm going to do whatever I can, and I'm going to be aware that there are operations that might go under the entire institution structure because of one bad apple or two bad apples, employees that are being bribed or whatever, and still make the reasonable efforts to try to prevent them, because that's where you want to go. That's what I think the message should be. And if you see there's millions of dollars in money laundering. And so, according to these decisions, so that is not an easy thing to let go. When you start seeing systematicity, repetition with different kinds of suspicious transactions, and the authority can see it, others can see it, people know about it outside, in the private sector. That's where it starts becoming something that I think, more legitimized. Okay, and so institutions have to say, I'm going to do as far as I can, as much as I can, to establish the best controls I can. And if after that some operation goes through and the US authorities want to go after me, I'll do everything I can to defend myself. Maybe I'll be in such a dark place that I won't survive it, but maybe I will. So you have to go to that probability. I think that's where you have to put your efforts on and say, first, I'm going to do everything I can so that I'm not in that spot. And second, if I am in that spot, I'm going to defend myself legitimately. And every judge, every jury, or many authorities will be cognizant of that. I think that's what you have to do. Because not doing anything just because it's impossible to avoid one dirty operation, it's just not the way to go. You put too much in risk.
Ricardo, following on from that, do you think the US government picked on these institutions, apart from them finding these transfers that look suspicious to them, because they weren't systemically important and it wouldn't kind of create a big problem, and that maybe some bigger banks had similar type of transactions, but they didn't want to create a ripple in Mexico's financial system?
Maybe. I couldn't second guess that. Seems probable. Or also that they want to send a message to the bigger institutions, first going after these ones and say, everybody else, take note of what I'm doing because it could be you next time. I wouldn't discard it, but I couldn't say if that's the strategy as such. And they are maybe pinpointing these institutions because there is some systematicity to their illegal operations or potentially illegal operations. There's always something to read between the lines, of course, Damien.
Do you think, just a couple more questions, Ricardo, do you think, you used to work in the finance ministry, is this sort of a slap in the face to Mexican regulators that we are basically going to regulate the Mexican financial system with this sort of nuclear weapon of blocking them from US access? Should they themselves sharpen their act up?
You mean the Mexican authorities?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I do. I think that the Financial Action Task Force has been very clear in evaluating Mexico. This is an intergovernmental organization specialized in combating money laundering, the financing of terrorism. It's the most important organization that does that. Mexico was a part of it for many, many years. I was a part of that when I was a public servant. And the FATF has said to Mexico, you need to be more efficient. You need to have more asset recovery actions. You have to have more convictions. You have to have more dissuasive sanctions. And we cannot deny it. I was part of the government and I was part of these meetings, international meetings, and it is true. We have to do what we can as authorities in Mexico, federally, locally, and in coordination with other authorities to combat money laundering and the financing of terrorism in Mexico as much as we can, and we have to do it better. It is a signal to us. It is a reality. And if I were to say, no, we're doing perfect, I would be a hypocrite. We need to be more efficient. The level of organized crime in our country is evident. Nobody can deny that. And so we have to stand up to the challenge.
Ricardo, in that sense, there's been a lot of talk that the CNBV, la Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, has lost some of its best talent because of low wages. Can we think that is an issue that the government should address to make sure that they have the right talent to combat these two very worrisome financing operations, money laundering, or funding terrorist activities?
Yeah, my personal opinion is that you do have to have good wages that are market level. We obviously know that since the previous administration and the current one follows the same policy, it is a different view. They are of the idea of bringing down the wages, at least in relation to what it was previously. I do not agree with that decision. I do think that we need technical public servants. I'm not saying there aren't any. I know many public servants that are very technical and are still in the government. Some I do know that left because they cannot pay the tuitions anymore from their kids and they cannot pay the mortgage. And so it is relevant. I do think that there should be competitive wages in Mexico, especially in these kinds of national security functions that the government has. I mean, public servants that work almost 24/7, whether in public security, prosecution services, financial regulation. I mean, they're doing big jobs, long hours, and I think that they should be retributed fairly in market level wages. I mean, that's my opinion.
Sounds good. Well, Ricardo, on my behalf, and Damien, if you want to add anything, I think that's been very, very illustrative inside information about how it's working out, your points of view. We're very thankful for coming into the show and talking to us about this very, very important thing that happened to the Mexican financial system. So unless you want to add anything else, I would leave it at that.
Thank you. We could talk about this for hours, but I think it was a good start, and I was delighted to be here with you. In case there's any follow-up, I'd be honored to keep it up and stay in communication with all of you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Damien?
Well, I think that's what we have this week, Eduardo. Enjoy London.
Thank you, Damien. I'll see you here.
Then don't forget to subscribe to Mex Moves. All the best.